But I think we should move on and really talk about what's next for Zelda. I don't know. The only thing that I know for sure is obviously we're still waiting on the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. And honestly, if I had to give my only real prediction for the Zelda series in the future, the only thing that I know is for certain is I think more Zelda games are going to double down on the changes introduced in Breath of the Wild, for better or worse. And more power to them. That, obviously it's considered a revolutionary Zelda game. It was considered a complete shakeup for the series. It's just not the direction that I really want the series to go in. And that's fine. I think of it interestingly, kind of like with, appropriately enough, it was an episode I talked about here, and it's kind of like with Sonic. This is almost like a new generation of Zelda, a new era of Zelda. And if Breath of the Wild style Zelda is what's in store for the series in the future, that's fine. But I can just stick with the Zeldas that I think I'll like. I can play A Link to the Past, and it's no worse because Zelda's going complete open world with full blown crafting and in these aspects that I'm not a fan of. I can still play Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask and Wind Waker and still get the Zelda experience that I would want, and still be happy. But I hope that the future of the 3D series is going to keep people happy, even if it is going in a direction that I am not a fan of. Similarly, I guess the direction then for the future that I'm more curious about is there more 2D Zelda in the future? What does 2D Zelda look like in the future? Can 2D Zelda coexist on a home console with 3D Zelda? Because you have to remember, for the most part, 2D Zelda post Ocarina of Time was just relegated to handhelds. Oracle of Seasons and Ages and Link's Awakening, those are all 2D. Minish Cap, 2D. Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, 2D. Link Between Worlds, 2D. And what's the connecting line between all of them? They're all on the Game Boy, the Game Boy Color, the Advance, the DS, or the 3DS. Now, with only the Switch, 2D Zelda needs to find a way to coexist or not exist at all. And, obviously I've laid it out here many times. I much prefer 2D Zelda, so I think it would be a crying shame if 2D Zelda were to go away. But I got to see what happens. That's, to me, the future of 2D Zelda is a lot more up in the air, and I'm really curious what happens with it. So, because I would imagine that 2D Zelda is going to hold on to more of those A Link to the Past conventions rather than go full-on open world like Breath of the Wild. So that's kind of what I foresee. As far as like other media, I'm kind of curious as well. I'm not sure. I know like historically there'd been like a manga going on for a long, long time, all the way from what was it, Ocarina of Time, maybe A Link to the Past through Twilight Princess. I'd be curious to see if that might make a comeback at all in the future. Obviously, we have the Mario movie coming. I'm wondering, I think, honestly, The Legend of Zelda is much more primed to be a movie, even if Link is a silent protagonist compared to Mario. But that could be very interesting if something like that were to come to pass. What else? As far as other media, I think it would be interesting to see the Zelda series branch out into something beyond just the games. But alas, that just kind of is what it is. So we have one more topic to go over here. One very special topic. One little sub-series of games that I hardly talked about here. The Zelda CDI Trilogy. So if you don't know what the Philips CDI is, I think I talked about it in the SNES episode. Enough to kind of have an idea of what we're talking about here, but it was a home multimedia system that could play video games that had some pretty bad Nintendo games on it that weren't actually Nintendo games. They were third-party developed, but they basically had the blessing of Nintendo, because what was going to happen was, Nintendo was going to partner with Sony to make the Nintendo PlayStation a device that would be the SNES CD, but that fell through because of money and profits and the companies just not being able to get along. And so instead, Nintendo partnered with Philips in hopes of creating such an add-on that never came to be. Wah, wah, wah. So, Philips still ended up making their home multimedia system, but they were allowed to make these games for it. And there were not one, not two, but 3 Zelda games. And 2 of them were more in the style of Zelda 2. So, I guess in starting with this question of how would you make CDI Zelda games good, I would start by not mimicking the most divisive Zelda game. I would not want to mimic Zelda 2 in making my first CD Zelda game on a home console that hardly anybody owned. Of course, you have to think about like what sorts of things could have improved the game. Not even just thinking about the content. Well, money is the solution to all problems. It seems if the games, maybe didn't have enough time, maybe they didn't have enough of a budget. I'm looking at this article here on ZeldaUniverse.net on why the CDI Zelda games failed, and they specifically, the first thing they bring up is, the developers had a year or so to make, or a little over a year to make 2 games, which, I mean, a little over a year it's hard to make 1 game, let alone 2 games, in such a time. So there would certainly be shortcuts that had to be taken. And similarly, the developers, this team Animation Magic, had $600,000 to work with, which granted, $600,000 in 1991, like the article says, is about $1.1 million today. But even a game like, I mean, it straight up says it, a game like E.T. on the Atari cost $22 million to make, which is insane, but I digress. For such a bad game to have cost so much. It's such a simple game at that, but I very much digress. Sometimes it could have just been something as simple as that. I think another big one would be, I'm not sure it was not Animation Magic specifically that did the cutscenes. According to this article, it was a handful of Russian animators that were brought in to do the cutscenes. So, maybe get better animators or better cutscenes and just, in general, better voice acting. Like, there are just so many little nitpicky things that could make the CDI games be that much better. Now, granted, obviously, I think, the CDI Zelda cutscenes are iconic for a reason because they are so bad. So in some ways, I'm kind of partial to them, but it does still make them good. So, and honestly, I guess part of the problem was just the CDI itself. You have to look at something like the controller, one of the controllers looks like a spoon that hardly has a D-pad or enough buttons to do anything on it. How do you play a game with that? Another controller looks like a remote control. Granted, there are some traditional game controller style controllers for the CDI, but even then, not all of the buttons could really be taken advantage of. I think, it's famous that a lot of the actions in Zelda on CDI requires you to press down. If you're standing in front of a door and you want to pull up the menu, you need to press down the button. But oh no, you're in front of a door and you press down, so you're going to go through the door. Just so use more buttons, or figure out different combinations that might not make the same actions happen with the same buttons. That would be a huge, huge, huge change. Let's see what else. Oh, of course, the combat itself. Oftentimes Link and Zelda, because to be fair, one of these is Link, the Faces of Evil, and the other one is Zelda, the Wand of Gamelon. You take a lot of damage for a couple of little things, and you just die and die and die and die. Of course, the games themselves don't run very well. They have a very choppy frame rate. If they could improve that, that would be just one thing that would make the CDI Zelda games that much better. Now, the thing, though, that I'm wondering, I guess, the big thing that still sticks out in my mind as what could potentially improve CDI Zelda is... oh my goodness, I just had the thought and I lost it. Oh my goodness. And I think I saw something in here that got me thinking about it in this article. It would, but, oh man, I hate it when I lose my thoughts. I don't know, maybe I'll think of it later and force myself to talk about it in a future episode, just write it down. But the CDI Zelda games, they're just such a train wreck. There's something that if it didn't cost an arm and a leg to play them the way they're meant to be played, I guess, to be fair, I would just be so interested in trying them and just seeing, like, what are they really and truly like. I don't know. I'm trying to think of a lot of the critiques I've seen, and I would rather not just kind of drone on here trying to say nothing than force myself to keep going when I'm just clearly unable to think of what I'm trying to think of. So it's just a shame, because the first CD Zelda game should have been fantastic. And granted, the Wind Waker, what I would consider the true first Zelda game on an optical medium, is, a pretty decent game. But these CDI games, man, they could have been so much more if they just did the obvious thing and mimicked what works. The main 2D Zelda games, rather than mimicking Zelda 2 and doing weird decisions like having to use strange button combinations and having multiple buttons do the same, or multiple actions on the same directions, and just oh goodness, wrapped up my cord. Having the terrible full motion videos, even if they are iconic and hilarious because of it. I haven't even thought about, like, the boss battles. The boss battles tend to be like, it's like a weird dichotomy of super hard enemies that kill you in a couple of hits, and bosses that can be taken down in, like, hitting it with one puzzle item. And just being kind of done with it after that. Oh, you have to do a lot of shopping. Rupees are super important. Oh, the level design. The level design could be improved, because there's often times where it's hard to tell what's in the foreground, what's in the background, where hitboxes for platforms are compared to the art. It's such a shame, because these could be, if they're remade, fantastic games. And I guess that's my main question, is because I swear I remember reading a while back that there was someone making, like, a PC port of Link the Faces of Evil just for funsies, but I don't think it's an actually full-blown remake that actually goes ahead and improves things. And I would be so curious to see a lot of these improvements come in, if only because, in a PC version, you could at least play it with a real controller that has a ton of buttons that you can hopefully map, like, oh, here's a menu button. Here's a a unique jump button instead of hitting up on the D-pad. That alone would improve the game significantly by having a jump button, because no game should make you jump by pressing up on the D-pad. That's ridiculous. Having separate, well, I know the sword and the item buttons are separate, but instead of having button combinations, you could just have full-blown buttons, because if I remember correctly, the item use is done by up and the button, up on the D-pad and the button, and it's strange. It's so strange. But alas, I think we have a very, very short one today, but that's okay. We need to have some short ones. I can't always, like I said in my 3DS and Wii episode, I don't always want to do these 2-hour marathons. I think that covers what I want to say for the Zelda series. I hope I covered enough for today, but certainly, like I said, if I'm ever in a Zelda-y mood, or if I'm plowing through a Zelda game, I would be happy to discuss this another time, hopefully with each individual game in more depth, more concrete opinions than what I can just give here, reminiscing on, what were these games like as I played them and haven't played them much in recent memory. But regardless, I think that will close out this podcast. Please, as always, do your typical sorts of engagement-y things on whatever platform you prefer. Maybe you can heart it on Google Podcasts. Maybe you could send in a voice message at anchor.fm/THECOP. I would love to see a voice message there. I still haven't gotten any. I'm waiting. I would love to have likes, subscriptions, all that sort of stuff on the video portion of the podcast. But regardless, I'm happy to see the Zelda series go on for 35 years, see how special it's been to people. I'm hoping the more I play these games, maybe I will figure out why they should be super special to me. And I hope to see it continue on for 35 more. That's right, I want to see the 70th anniversary of The Legend of Zelda on NES. Wouldn't that be a time? So with that, folks, I think that closes up this episode here. Thank you for listening or watching in, and I will see you in one more Creative Outlet Gaming Birthday Extravaganza episode here. Thank you very much.